Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on classification and phylogeny. What we're going to be doing in this video is having a look at our specification reference 4.2.2d, the relationship between classification and phylogeny. First thing then, when we talk about classification, we are purely talking about this process of sorting things into groups. So obviously, because we are studying biology, this is going to be sorting living organisms into groups based on certain characteristics. Now, one of the ways that we can actually classify these living organisms is using this thing called artificial classification. Now, artificial classification is grouping these different living things in a way that's pretty easy to remember, and it allows us to find something quite easily through this classification system. Key things to know about it is we are literally basing this on a limited number of characteristics. So it's only based on a few characteristics, and there's none of this evolutionary relationship that may be present taken into account. So purely when we're talking artificial classification, we'd be doing things like having a look to see, does it have wings? How many pairs of wings? Is its body segmented, etc.? All of that gives us a little bit of a way to sort these things into their groups. Now, what we do find is that once we've carried out this artificial classification, we've got limited information from it. But because we have purely selected these observable features, then it's pretty stable. It's not like an animal with wings, it's all of a sudden not going to have wings later. So we've got a stable form of classification, but there's no link to those evolutionary relationships. It's purely based on those observable features. Option number 2 in terms of how we can classify things would be the natural classification system. This is the one that is going to be looking to see how closely related different species are, and then placing those closely related genera together within these different groups. So what we'd end up with is all of the species that are closely related would end up in the same genus. Any of those genera that are closely related would end up in the same family, etc. So what we're really doing here is looking at a large number of characteristics that do involve those evolutionary relationships. So because of that, we're going to have a lot of information provided through this system, and it is going to change. As our knowledge advances and expands, we may well look at something and think this needs altering. Which leads us very nicely onto this idea of phylogeny. Whenever we talk about phylogeny, we are referring to the study of these evolutionary relationships that exist between different organisms. So pretty much phylogeny is the way to think about a massive family tree of every living thing on planet Earth. What we're doing is we're literally trying to sort of look at these organisms and go, right, okay, you two are more closely related than these ones, so you're going to be on a more similar branch of our little phylogenetic tree. What our phylogeny actually tells us is that any of the species currently living today will share a common ancestor at some point in the past. Now, some of these will have a common ancestor relatively recently in the past. Other species, we're going back a long time to get that common ancestor. But at some point in the history of Earth, there is going to be a common ancestor for all of these species alive today. Now, what we can do with this information, once we've worked out roughly when they had that common ancestor, what we do when we construct these phylogenetic trees is we set up a little branch point. So basically, at that point that the two organisms started to evolve as separate entities, then that will be a branch on the phylogenetic tree. And the more recent that common ancestor, then the more closely related the two species are to one another. A couple of phrases that I am going to go through I can't remember them ever coming up on an exam paper, but you know, you never know at the end of the day. We can talk about the clade first of all. Now, when we talk about clade, this is a monophyletic taxon, i.e. a group of organisms which includes the most recent common ancestor of all its members and all of the descendants of that most recent common ancestor. So basically what we're looking at here is we do have that common ancestor, the most recent version of it, and then all of the descendants from that. The cladogram is the diagram which is going to depict this, in theory, branching of all of those different lineages. And wherever we get that branching, that exact point that those two lines come away from each other, that's referred to as a node. And what we find is at the end of each of those points on our cladogram, then we have all of our taxa. When it comes to this whole process of cladistics, then we're making three pretty big assumptions, I suppose. First one is that any group of organisms are related by descent from this common ancestor. So the only way that any organisms are in existence is because at some point they have a common ancestor with one another. Second assumption we make is that there's a change in characteristics occurring in these lineages over time. So that's really linking into the ideas of evolution, really. And our third one is that we've got this bifurcating pattern of cladogenesis. Now, that's a really fancy way of saying that at any point that we've got, obviously here's our little branch, then any time that we get this little split, it's going to go two ways. Hence bifurcating, because if we look at bi, that just means two. So basically what we find is at any point that we get this split from the common ancestor, it's literally splitting into two potential pathways. Now, what we actually have are two different terms that we need to understand what they're referring to here. So cladistics is where we're going to actually create these branching patterns that then make up our phylogenetic trees. And phylogenetics is referring to the interpretation of those diagrams. So what we would do is we'd use cladistics to generate this little thing at the bottom, and phylogenetics is where we're then going to interpret what it actually means. So if we have a look at our little phylogenetic tree, so we can understand how to interpret this. First thing is that we've got all of our terminal taxa at the top there, labelled A, B, C, D, E, F, G and H. Now this is going to be basically the present day. And what we find is that the further down this we go, the further into the past we go. So what we actually find here is that those little nodes, those little coloured blobs on this diagram that are closer to the top are more recent. Now, at each of the nodes, because we've made this assumption that it's a bifurcating pattern, then we are going to have two branches coming off from that node. Now, the node is representing this common ancestor. So let's have a look at one little section. Let's have a look at B and C. So what we've got, B and C then, are going to be closely related because they've got this node, which is representing their common ancestor, relatively recently in the past, and because they're branching from that one node, then what we can say is they're going to share many features with each other. We could also make this statement that B and C have a common ancestor in the recent past, because we've got that little node, that branching point, and that is relatively recently that it happened. So their common ancestor is in the recent past. Now, the other things that we can go on to say is having a little look at some other sections. Let's have a look at our other side. Let's go to E there. Now, E is going to be closely related to F because that little orange node there represents the common ancestor in the recent past. And E is going to be more closely related to F than it is to D because that little grey blob is representing the common ancestor of organism D and organism E, because if we look, we've got our two branches, one going off to D, and the other is then going to go up towards that pink node first of all, where we get another branching up to the orange node, and then we get to E. So what we actually find is we can make this little statement that E and F are more closely related than E is to D, because their common ancestor is more recent than that of the common ancestor of D and E. As always, I do recommend that you subscribe to the channel so you can see when I next upload another video, and of course head on over to the A-Level Biology website where you can find a range of other resources, all designed to hopefully help you in studying A-Level biology.